without further ado, we're going to get the party started here with our very first presenter. I'm excited to present Jeff Sussna, who's going to be talking about delivering strategic outcomes with Scrum and Kanban. Here you go, Jeff.
Thanks, Maria. I am so happy to be here. I'm so happy to be someplace that isn't my house or the supermarket. I'm also really happy to be giving an in-person talk. I'm the kind of person I have a really hard time giving a talk if I can't walk around. So sitting or standing in front of a little webcam is really, really hard for me. My background is more years than I care to admit at this point of designing, building, and running large software systems. I'm closing in on my 11th of those years running a consulting firm here in the Twin Cities. Our clients are product and service organizations, and what they all have in common, whether it's a product-facing, customer-facing product team, or an IT department, or even a nonprofit that's supporting homeless people, is the need to evolve both what they deliver and how they deliver it. So we provide coaching and workshops that helps them learn how to use Agile and Lean and service design together in order to continuously evolve with their customers' needs. And we often get brought into an organization that is doing some form of Agile or DevOps and not quite getting the results they're expecting. You could think of us as a tuning and repair shop. You know, we're doing Scrum, we have an SRE team, but why aren't we getting the gas mileage we were promised? And there's lots for us to do, and there's lots of low-hanging fruit. One of the most common ones is helping teams make their work smaller. We have 2-week sprints, and we have 8-day user stories. But at some point, everyone runs into the same issue, which is the Agile team bumps up against product management and design and leadership and even customers, and there's this tension between agility on the one hand and strategy or product vision or strategic direction on the other hand. And this manifests in a number of ways. I have conversations with executives who say, well, we know we need empowered autonomous teams, but how can we trust them to make good business decisions? Scrum Masters and Agile coaches and product owners all worry about, well, how do we make sure that everybody understands why we're building what we're building? So that teams aren't just sort of pounding out one feature after another without any context to their work. Designers and product managers are stressed about how do we actually make meaningful experience improvements and not just chip away at the edges making little incremental improvements because we're stuck in these 1-week or 2-week increments. And finally, ultimately, the idea of telling your customers, well, we can't tell you anything about anything beyond the next 2 weeks doesn't really fly. And the classic way that this manifests is the dreaded Agile Fall, where you have a very traditional feature and date-based roadmap, and then you chop it up into lots of little pieces and micromanage it. And one of my favorite experiences was a presentation where somebody stood up and presented a very traditional waterfall roadmap that said, this is what we're going to do in Q1, Q2, Q3, Q4, but because we're Agile, we might change the dates. In other words, the roadmap was a work of fiction, and its primary purpose was to frustrate people because he was saying up front, we're going to make a set of promises and we're not going to keep them. Now, a lot of people say that Agile Fall is Agile done wrong, but I think the problem is more complex than that. It really represents this mismatch between what are we doing now and where are we trying to go. And the truth about Agile is it doesn't have much to say about the connection between those two things. It kind of leaves it as an exercise for the student. So how do we put those two together? How do we bring agility and strategy together so that they don't fight against each other? And the answer is actually really simple. It's not easy, but it's simple. It involves managing both strategy and tactics in terms of outcomes instead of outputs. So instead of talking about how many touchdowns you scored and how many interceptions you had, did you win the game? If you had 5 touchdowns and 4 interceptions and the other team had 4 touchdowns and no interceptions, but they had 3 field goals, guess what? They win and you lose. So at the strategic level, we can talk about outcomes like, imagine if Slack were actually an effective tool for controlling information overload. They say that that's part of their value proposition, but we all complain about how it actually makes the problem worse instead of better. Or you have a website that's very slow and your customers are very frustrated. How about getting rid of that frustration as an outcome? Or you have an online invoicing service that people use. And in order to understand the state of my business and my revenue, I have to look a lot of different places. It's very disjointed. So what I want to do is I want to streamline the process of understanding the state of my business. At the tactical level, we can talk about things like, well, let's let Slack users filter out unimportant posts. So if somebody posts something to the team channel of, well, we're going to Arby's for lunch, you know what? I'm busy. I don't want to know about that. But if what they post is we have an outage and everybody has to get on a bridge, I want to know about that. Or let's make the home page 50% faster as the first part of getting rid of our customers' frustration. Or maybe if I want to understand how much revenue should I expect to get this quarter, if I can see my outstanding invoices and my unbilled time together, that'll be really helpful. And the thing about all of these is we've said absolutely nothing yet of what we're going to build or how we're going to build it in order to achieve those outcomes. And so we can take this idea of managing outcomes and we can actually build it into the way we already do Agile. So when we're planning, instead of saying, well, our sprint goal for this sprint is we're going to finish 24 user stories, our sprint goal becomes we want to reduce frustration over slow performance by 25%. Stand-ups. I could give an entire talk. I could probably run a whole day workshop about my opinions about stand-ups and good stand-ups and bad stand-ups. And one of my pet peeves is the stand-up where everybody goes around and they say, I'm working on story 1, 2, 3, no blockers. I'm working on story 4, 5, 6, no blockers. Well, that's interesting, but it's not actually all that useful. Imagine instead where somebody stands up and says, today I made the home page 15% faster. Now that's interesting, that's motivating, that's useful. Or maybe they say, I thought I was going to make it 15% faster, but I actually made it 20% slower. Now you have something you can use to inspect and adapt, which is what your stand-up's supposed to be about. And finally, you do a retro, and you thought that there were 10 pages that you needed to fix in order to make things faster. And you find out you only got 3 of them done, but customer frustration went down by 40%. You did less work than you planned, but the outcome was even better. Now, before we go any further, I want to say something about this word outcome, because you can read a lot about outcomes over outputs, and it's somewhat confusing, and in my opinion, they tend to skip over an important step. When you look at things like OKRs or lean UX or hypothesis-driven development, you'll find this little algebra that goes something like this. We believe that if we build feature X, it will cause change in customer behavior Y that will lead to desired business outcome Z. So we'll make this change and users will look at more pages and that will drive more ad revenue. But why are customers changing their behavior? What is the benefit to them? How does it help them accomplish something they want to accomplish? So what we're really talking about here is shifting our focus somewhat away from this is what we're doing and this is where we want to go to this is what our customers are trying to do and this is why they need our help. And asking this question, why, about the work we're doing or the work we're proposing to do is really powerful. It's shown that when people understand why they're doing what they're doing, quality goes up, motivation goes up, productivity goes up. Your testing is better because you aren't just testing whether the widget flashes 3 times when it's supposed to flash 3 times. You're also testing whether a flashing widget actually does what the user needs it to do. And because you're focused on the customer and what they're trying to do and not just on yourself, you deliver customer value. But perhaps most powerfully, and what I'm really trying to talk about today, is that when everyone is aligned on outcomes, there's freedom to figure out how to get there, which gives us exactly this combination of strategy and alignment on the one hand and agility on the other. And we can use this to engage in what we might call lean strategy, which is this notion of continuously refining your ability to both understand and deliver what it is your customers need. And we can do it by asking 4 simple yet really powerful questions. First, what help do our customers need? What is it they can't do on their own that we might help them do? Secondly, how are we promising to help them? What are we allowing them to do to achieve that goal? Third, how well do we actually fulfill those promises? And those 3 questions allow us to ask the 4th one, which is, how can we become more helpful, both by fulfilling our existing promises more effectively and by making more useful ones? So if we use Slack as an example, what is the need? Why do you need Slack? Or why do you think you need Slack? In order to get work done together across boundaries. If everybody's sitting in the same room at the same time and you all have the same manager, you don't need Slack, you just talk to each other. So how does Slack promise to help you? Well, it allows you to have structured conversations, so you don't just have this pile of stuff sitting in your inbox, that are both real-time and non-real-time. So we can be chatting, and then one of us can go to lunch and then come back from lunch and see what happened in the meantime and re-engage with the conversation. Another promise that Slack makes is the ability to manage information overload. And as we know, it doesn't do so well on that front. And so once we ask these questions, we can start to create a roadmap of what the answers are. Now, we talked about product roadmaps a lot, but most of the time they're not actually maps. They're routes. A map is something that shows you a landscape, where you are, what's around you. It allows you to ask, where do we want to go and how might we get there? If we're in New York City and we want to get to Poughkeepsie, we can look at the map and we can say, well, we can take the highway. It's fast, but it's kind of boring. Or we can take the back roads that looks like it's probably really pretty, but it goes through a lot of towns, so it'll probably be slow. And most importantly, it allows you the answer to the question of what do we do when things change? So you're driving along on your back roads and it's really pretty, but it's really, really slow because all the leaf peepers are out. And you say, well, it's getting late. We're not going to make it to the hotel on time. We really need to hop on the highway. Or we're not going to make it at all. We need to find a hotel in the next town. And so when we have a value-based map, which is really a map, we can represent this very simply in a visual format. For those of you who are familiar with Wordly maps, this is a simplified version of a Wordly map. If you look at it from the top down, the top row is the need. Slack lets you get work done together across boundaries. The middle row is how you help them fulfill that need, structured conversations, creating channels on the fly, so on and so forth. The bottom row is what you need in order to keep your promises. So if Slack is a system where people are coming and going very dynamically, they probably need elastic, scalable infrastructure. And then if you arrange things from left to right, it shows you how effectively you keep each of those promises. So Slack is pretty good in general, But there's this thing hanging off on the left, information overload, which is a problem. And so maybe Slack decides we need to solve that. We need to transform Slack into a truly effective tool for controlling information overload. Wow, that sounds like a great objective in the OKR language. It's compelling, it's challenging, it's aspirational, it's directional. This is your product strategy. We are going to make our tool effective in this area where it's not at all effective now. And then the next step is to ask, well, how are we going to get there? What's the next step or the first step we're going to take along the way? And maybe it's to allow users to filter out posts that aren't important. So we can look at this and we can see the landscape of what our product is and what its value proposition is. We can see the operational reality. How good are we at all of the things we claim we can do? We can see our strategic direction, and we can see the next step along that path all in one place. And we can use that to have conversations and make decisions and remake decisions as things change. We implemented this thing, it didn't really help as much as we thought. We need to try something else. Or maybe we did it, and you know what? 50% of the Twitter snark about Slack suddenly disappeared. Maybe that's good enough. We can move on and do something else. So when we actually start mapping and talking about things from a value perspective, it allows us to bring agility and strategy together. First of all, because we're talking about evolution. We're talking about getting better in some meaningful direction. We're not just talking about spitting out the next set of features. Secondly, it leaves the freedom to inspect and adapt, which is at the heart of what Agile is about. And the key here, what this is really all about, is when we align with customers and with each other in terms of the outcomes that we're trying to create, it allows us to have this very flexible yet coherent approach to things. So that's great, but how do you actually do it? How do we go from where we are, where most of us are used to this model where whether it's waterfall or whether it's agile, what we're trying to do is ship the next set of features, finish the next set of user stories. How do we make this transition? And the answer is to start where you are. So you can take your Jira board, or whatever you're using, you can take your epics and your user stories, and you can ask yourself, well, what is the customer value that's associated with this piece of work that we've already decided to do? Why are we doing it? Now, one of the things that I've learned is that shifting your way of thinking from what to why, from output to outcome, is a lot harder than it seems. And I discovered a nice little trick for doing it. I was working with a DevOps team, and one of their user stories was to build a Kubernetes version of their application. It was a very complicated multi-tier app. It was very hard to configure properly. So they were going to port it to Kubernetes. And I sat down with the engineer who was working on it, and I said, well, what is the customer promise behind this story? And he said, well, it's right in the title. Kubernetes version of our app. And then, without really thinking about it, I said, well, if the CEO walked over to your desk and said, why am I paying you to do this work? What would you say? And he instantaneously, without thinking about it, had a really good answer. He said, well, when we're done, any engineer can test their changes against a production-like version of the application anytime they want. And I said, wow, that's fantastic. If I were the CEO, I would be really happy I was paying you to do that work. The other thing about it is it gives us a much better definition of success. So if we have this nice Kubernetes version of the app and it spins itself up in 50 milliseconds, but you need a PhD in Helm charts to make it work, it's not successful. Or if all you have to do is push a button, but it takes an hour and a half to spin itself up, it's also not successful. If you are in an environment where you are being driven by or driving yourself from business objectives, you can ask yourself, what customer value could we deliver that would meet or lead to this business objective? So you can kind of work backwards and inject an understanding of customer benefit into what you're doing. And then finally, and most importantly, and this is the point where the strategy meets the agility, what is the smallest step we can take to move in this direction? You know, the problem with strategic progress or meaningful improvements isn't that you're doing work in small pieces. That's actually a really good way to innovate. The problem is when you're just kind of doing random work, right? Let's change all the buttons from blue to green, now we're done. Let's build this new widget, now we're done. Let's do this new integration, now we're done. But when we have a strategic direction in terms of what value we're trying to deliver, then we can talk about making small steps that are going in some direction and getting us to where we want to go strategically. And when I talk to folks about actually mapping this way, they're unsure of how to get started. Well, you're talking about doing strategy. So does that mean that we have to start at the top? Does it have to come from the executives or the head of product management or whatever the case may be? And the answer is no. You can start anywhere. I have done this with private cloud teams inside of IT departments. I've done it with manual QA groups who are wondering, what is our job going to be in a year now that we have continuous delivery and everything's automated and the developers are doing all their testing, all their own testing? You know, how do we evolve to provide value to the organization if we're not sitting there writing test plans and manually executing tests? And again, you can kind of back your way into it of just starting by saying, okay, what are our features? What do we do? What do we build? And then asking, well, what do those features let customers do? Right? The invoicing service, when I create an invoice, it should allow me to send a request for payment to a client that satisfies all of the client's formatting requirements. If you're like me and you do consulting and you work with large organizations and some of them are European, they all have these different requirements that if you don't have this thing in exactly the right place, the invoice will get rejected, which is not what you want. And then from there, you can ask, well, what is all of this stuff actually helping the customer achieve? And then finally, well, what are we good at? What are we not so good at in terms of achieving all of these goals? And on one level, if you want to know where your strengths and weaknesses are, if you want to know how you are and aren't fulfilling your promises to your customers, just ask support, because they know, because they hear it. But at some level, you also need to do research. And I'll tell you, in my experience, one of the very best and most humbling things you can do is get an opportunity to just watch your customers try to use your product. And you're not allowed to say anything, you're not allowed to help them, you're not allowed to give them hints, you just have to watch. And it can be really, really painful and really humbling and make you go back and say, oh, this really nice JavaScript code I wrote is really lousy because it's really hard to use. So on that note, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure walking around here in front of all of you for 25 minutes. If you are interested in value-based management, mapping, talk to me. I love to talk about it. I love to do it. Thanks, everyone.